For most of human history, the countries that quietly shaped the world were not always the ones with the largest armies or the most dramatic political speeches, but the ones that controlled the infrastructure through which global trade actually moved. Because power in the modern world is deeply connected to logistics. The movement of energy, resources, manufactured goods, raw materials, and information across oceans, continents, and digital networks. And every generation witnesses at least one transformation in how these flows move across the planet. Sometimes through the construction of canals, sometimes through railways, pipelines, fiber-optic cables, or entirely new maritime corridors. And the nations that recognize these changes early are usually the ones that gain the greatest long-term advantages. Because infrastructure once built becomes incredibly difficult to ignore or reverse it. Quietly shapes economic behavior for decades, guiding where ships sail, where factories are built, where investment capital flows, and even which cities grow into global financial hubs. And today, the world may be standing at the beginning of another transformation that is unfolding slowly, almost invisibly outside of public attention. While governments, corporations, and logistics giants calculate the future of trade routes that could reshape global commerce during the 21st century. Every year, roughly 90% of international trade moves by sea, which means that more than $14 trillion worth of goods travel across the oceans aboard tens of thousands of cargo ships carrying everything from consumer electronics automobiles and industrial machinery to food supplies, medical equipment, oil, natural gas, and the raw materials required to sustain modern manufacturing economies. Yet those ships do not simply move randomly across the water. They follow carefully calculated corridors that balance efficiency, safety, fuel consumption, and geopolitical risk, which is why certain narrow maritime choke points have historically become some of the most strategically valuable locations on Earth. Places where global shipping routes converge, such as the Strait of Malacca, connecting the Indian and Pacific Oceans, the Suez Canal linking the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, and the Panama Canal creating a shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific, and each of these routes fundamentally reshaped world trade when it opened. Because shortening shipping distances by thousands of kilometers reduces fuel costs, accelerates delivery schedules, lowers insurance risks, and allows shipping companies to deploy their fleets more efficiently, which in turn reduces the price of transporting goods across continents, making global trade faster, cheaper, and more interconnected than it would otherwise be. The Suez Canal, for example, transformed commerce between Europe and Asia when it opened in the 19th century, eliminating the need for ships to sail around the entire African continent. While the Panama Canal later created a similar revolution for trade between the east and west coasts of the Americas, and these examples reveal an important lesson about how economic influence works in practice, because the countries that build or control key transport infrastructure often gain leverage far beyond the direct revenue collected from transit fees. They gain influence over supply chains, maritime safety regulations, environmental standards, and the strategic calculations of every company that depends on those routes. And once global trade patterns adapt to a new pathway, they tend to remain stable for long periods of time, since businesses invest billions of dollars. Building ports, distribution centers, warehouses, pipelines, rail connections, and digital networks designed to integrate with the corridor, creating a self-reinforcing economic ecosystem, where traffic increases, which justifies more infrastructure, which attracts even more traffic, gradually turning a simple route into a central artery of global commerce. And today, several emerging maritime regions are beginning to attract attention from policymakers and economists because changing environmental conditions, advances in ship design, satellite navigation systems, and massive infrastructure investments are opening possibilities that were previously considered impractical or too risky. Particularly in northern ocean regions where seasonal ice coverage has historically blocked commercial navigation for most of the year, but where warming temperatures and improved ice-capable vessels are gradually expanding the window during which ships can safely travel. And for the global shipping industry, even a modest reduction in travel distance can translate into enormous financial savings, since a single large container ship can burn tens of thousands of dollars worth of fuel each day, meaning that shortening a route by several days across thousands of annual voyages could collectively save billions in operating costs, which is why governments are now studying these emerging passages with increasing seriousness, building modern ports capable of handling ultra-large container ships, deploying new fleets of ice-capable vessels, installing advanced satellite monitoring systems to track weather and sea conditions, and laying underwater fiber-optic communication cables to support navigation data and digital connectivity across remote ocean regions. Because a modern shipping corridor is no longer just a path across water, it is a complex, integrated system combining maritime infrastructure, digital networks, environmental monitoring, and emergency response capabilities designed to ensure that commercial vessels can operate reliably and safely. And once such a system becomes operational, it begins attracting shipping traffic almost automatically. Since logistics companies always prioritize routes that minimize uncertainty and maximize efficiency. And this is where the concept of infrastructure power becomes especially important because infrastructure tends to outlast political disputes or short-term policy changes once a port is built, once navigation systems are installed, once fiber optic cables are laid across the ocean floor, and once shipping companies restructure their supply chains around a particular corridor. The physical and economic momentum created by that infrastructure becomes extremely difficult for competitors to disrupt or replicate quickly, even if they possess similar financial resources. Constructing equivalent facilities requires years of engineering, environmental approval, workforce mobilization, and capital investment, which is why early movers in major infrastructure projects often gain advantages that compound over decades as more ships choose their routes. More cargo passes through their ports and more businesses design their global operations around the reliability of those corridors. Economists sometimes compare these dynamics to gravitational forces within the global economy because once a trade route becomes dominant, it begins attracting additional layers of economic activity. Nearby manufacturers move production facilities closer to efficient transport hubs. Logistics companies build warehouses and distribution centers in surrounding regions. Technology firms deploy communication infrastructure along the same pathways, and financial institutions establish services that support the growing flow of commerce, gradually turning the corridor into a powerful engine of regional development and international connectivity. Yet what makes the current transformation particularly fascinating is how quietly much of it is unfolding. While public attention remains focused on political conflicts, economic cycles, and headline-driven crises, far from television cameras and daily news coverage, engineers, construction crews, maritime planners, and technology companies are methodically building the foundations of future trade networks expanding. Deep water ports installing automated cargo handling systems, testing autonomous navigation technologies, and designing ships capable of traveling safely through environments that were once considered too hostile for regular commerce. Because the shipping industry has always adapted quickly to technological and environmental changes whenever new opportunities arise. After all, the fundamental logic of global logistics is brutally simple. If a route becomes faster, safer, or cheaper, the industry will eventually shift toward it, and when that shift occurs, the effects ripple outward across the entire world. Economy altering trade balances, manufacturing strategies, investment patterns, and geopolitical relationships, which is why policymakers and strategists increasingly view infrastructure development not merely as an economic project, but as a long-term strategic investment capable of shaping national influence far into the future, because the ability to facilitate trade reliably, efficiently, and at large scale creates partnerships and dependencies that extend beyond traditional diplomacy. Countries whose ports and corridors support the movement of global goods become indispensable to international commerce. And that indispensability translates into political leverage, economic resilience, and technological leadership over time. And this insight explains why many governments are now allocating billions of dollars toward maritime infrastructure research, ice-capable shipbuilding, satellite surveillance systems, and coastal logistics hubs, even in remote regions where current traffic remains relatively modest, because they are not only building for present demand, they are building for the trade patterns of the next several decades. And history repeatedly demonstrates that by the time a new corridor becomes obviously valuable, the most critical infrastructure decisions have already been made years earlier. During a period when the project still seemed uncertain or speculative, the same dynamic occurred with railroads in the 19th century, with transcontinental pipelines in the 20th century, and with global fiber optic communication cables in the early internet era. The organizations that invested during the early uncertain stages ultimately controlled the networks that billions of people later depended upon, and the same principle may now be unfolding again across the oceans, where climate shifts, technological innovation, and strategic investment are gradually redrawing the invisible highways that connect the world's economies. And when historians look back on this period, they may not focus on the speeches, debates, or political rivalries that dominated headlines, but rather on the quieter decisions made by engineers, planners, investors, and policymakers who recognize that controlling the infrastructure of trade is often more consequential than winning any single diplomatic argument. Because once ships begin sailing along a new corridor, once global companies sign long-term logistics contracts, and once billions of dollars in commerce begin flowing through newly built ports, the transformation becomes self-sustaining. The routes solidify, the economic relationships deepen, and the countries that built the foundations of that system discover that they have quietly positioned themselves at the center of a network that will shape global commerce for decades to come, proving once again that the most powerful forces in the world economy are not always the loudest or most dramatic, but the steady accumulation of infrastructure investment, technological capability, and logistical efficiency that slowly redirects the movement of goods, capital, and information across the planet until one day the map of global trade looks different than it did before. And the new pathways have become so essential that it is difficult to imagine how the world ever functioned without them.